Okay, thank you all for joining us. This is the first session of Hyperstition, and it's an extension of Ben and I's seminar from a few months ago, which we did Hyperstition and a New Weird. This will be trying to extend upon the concept of hyperstition and to explore more science fiction, and also explore concepts of fictional worlds, possible futures, politics, ethics, and time. So with me without an image is Ben. We will both be sort of leading the seminar, and we have our guest today is Paul Ennis, who's here with us. So it's nice for I know we have a lot of people who are here from Ireland right now, and I know it's very late. So thank you for being here at this time. And general structure, we've had two people here did the last session with us. So it's very laid back. Ben and I just picked a few texts in which we're finding some of these questions to be interesting, and I think we want to explore them along with you. I don't think either of us I'm not speaking for him, but considers himself an expert in anything we're doing. We're just kind of an experiment with these things and these ideas, and mostly it will be built on discussion. Today we're going to discuss Meillassoux' book, which is science fiction, extra science fiction, and we also will discuss the Isaac Asimov short story if anybody wants to, along with we have another short story by Willis as well. What's the first name?
Connie.
Yeah, Connie Willis. So, so I think Ben recently just gave a talk on something that's very similar, or like a very similar concept to this. So I'm going to pass it on to Ben. He's going to kind of outline what we mean by fictional worlds, possible futures, and kind of give a general context for the class. So, Ben.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So one of the things we want to explore in the course is this relationship between possible and fictional, and how that relationship changes or doesn't change as it moves from fictional narratives, scientific narratives, ethical, political narratives, how that works. So one thing to talk about is kind of relationship between fictional and possible. So yeah, as Tony mentioned, I did a talk in Melbourne. Tried to make a schema for how these things relate. So basically, possible worlds. When people say possible world, it's generally taken that it's built off our world. It's our world where something else could happen, right? There's some possibility that is generally not too extravagant in the way it's talked about. That possible is the materials of our world, something could happen in which a different future would emerge. That's the kind of like generic discussion of it. Whereas in the philosophical tradition, especially with someone like David Lewis, for him, possible worlds is everything that could happen would imply a different world, and he thinks this is an important way of illustrating the categories of modality, of necessity, contingency, possibility, these kinds of concepts that are in our language. He thinks implies worlds are as real as our world, which people have given him a lot of crap for that. That's a bit too extravagant. So possible world is just this kind of consistent world based on, often discussed as this world that just kind of unfolds from the known possibilities in some way. But fictional worlds are similar and can function in a similar way in that fictional worlds are generally more or less parasitic on the real world. If you think of different genres, something like a crime show or a drama seems to take place in our world, and there's nothing necessarily that sets it apart immediately from what we would call our world. Whereas a genre like horror, for instance, may be our world plus zombies, or our world with a particular serial killer in it, or something like this. And then that relationship, that parasitism between our world and the fictional world becomes more extreme with fantasy and sci-fi, because that often implies constructing fictional, whole solar systems, galaxies, kinds of life, whatever it is, that may be more or less building upon what we know about our world or what could happen. So in those regards, those ones that are less parasitic on our world have to explore more extravagant possibilities. But of course, so fictional and possible overlap quite a bit, but not fully. And so whereas fictional worlds often tends to suggest this kind of free and open kind of creation, possible world often implies a more grounded kind of imaginary. But I think one thing we want to talk about is how that might not necessarily play out in certain kinds of politics or in certain kinds of thinking when it comes to the relationship between science fiction and science, or between knowledge and being, or whatever it is. Yeah, I think we'll stop there. If that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, at this, I would just break a simple breakpoint. If anybody has any questions for Ben on this or comments, we can move on to Meillassoux. But if they have questions, perhaps about how it ties into the first seminar. I mean, I guess one thing before we jump into the book is you can type in the chat too if you don't want to actually say anything. It's fine. I can pay attention there, as well as if we've all read this or not, because I don't know if everybody has gotten a hold of the book.
Yeah.
Derek, you've read it?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Okay, not yet. So I know Chris is here, has read it. Paul's read it.
The Meillassoux?
Yes.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. I knew you got it. So I've read it sometime. Okay, perfect. All right. So then I guess there's two that there's a few that haven't read it, so we can kind of walk through it a little bit. But first, before we get into it, we invited Paul to come and give us a little context of Meillassoux, and kind of give us a little framework to jump into this book. I think it will be helpful for the people who haven't read it, especially. So, Paul?
Yeah. It's a pretty fascinating text. I mean, I'm not sure how well everybody can hear me, yeah?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Yeah, that's fine.
Great. So, it's been published in Speculative Solution CD years ago. It's in the Realism, Materialism art book as well. And now it has the univocal text. So it's, and it was also in a magazine a few years ago. So it's always been around as a kind of, interesting text. It seems to have a life of its own. And I was very interested that it was chosen for this course in particular. For me, of course, Meillassoux mostly is, after finitude and divine in existence, that kind of thing, But when I kind of reread it, so I reread it yesterday. It's a long time since I'd kind of, properly looked at it. What struck me is that So Meillassoux is known as the anti-correlationist speculative realist guy. So that's the kind of theme, the way he's being presented to the English-speaking world. Yet, nonetheless, if you go to like his web page or to communicate with him, he always says the main thing that interests him is Hume's problem. So he lists this as his kind of main area of research or interest. So Hume's problem of induction is Meillassoux' most interested in kind of area, despite the fact that he's presented as this the guy that gets us out of anti-realism and so on. And he calls it, of course, imaginative rationalism. One thing that's kind of missing from the text because it's so short is that we don't really get much of the sense of the kind of hyper chaos, So this idea that, we have in after finitude, we have the primary absolute, which is the in itself, and which is taken from Descartes, and the derivative absolute, which is, reaching, primary qualities and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of absent from this text, which is sort of interesting. But what's notable is that after finitude ends by saying, I can't prove this yet. So then he says, well, I'll prove it in the Berlin lecture, eventually, which he kind of does, But what I like about this text in particular is that the real kind of meat of his work, what makes him, at least to me, interesting, is that it focuses on the in-totalization, or the non-whole, non-all, all that kind of stuff. That seems to be the trajectory that he's kind of hinting at. So there are articles like this, like the contingency of the laws of nature, which is kind of a longer version of the Hume's problem chapter in After Finitude. So what's interesting is that he goes through something he does in After Finitude, but he leaves it in the footnotes. He says, like, check out After Finitude, that's where you'll find the answer, which is essentially the idea that Leibniz, Kant, and Hume all fail to solve the problem of induction, and all for different reasons. So Hume fails because he translates it into a psychological issue, habituation, and so on. So it's a non-philosophical answer. Kant, he says, does okay, but at least treats it kind of in the correct manner. But essentially, Kant's answer is that there is only necessity, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to represent the world. The world would just look chaotic. So he has that nice mix of, like, how would we be able to tell between dreaming and reality unless we had some sort of representation, causality. He singles out causality as one of the categories. Yeah, so one of the things that I think is kind of missing in the text, which maybe might help in terms of understanding the book, which is very, very short, of course, is that he, in After Finitude, in this famous sort of passage, page 52 of After Finitude, he turns facticity, so the idea we can't find any ground or reason for why things are the way they are. He essentially says we need to trust rationality, and he trusts reason over. So instead of like Hume's sort of solution of saying it's just habituation, he says we should trust reality, and reality tells us that things could change for no reason at all. So the capacity to be other is to be celebrated, as he puts it. So he turns facticity, something we've taken for a long time, into a absolute ontological principle, as he calls it. So one other area is rhetoric. So especially in the context of fiction, it's quite clear that Meillassoux is a rhetorical writer, and he uses his he kind of sets his enemies up in some way, you know, in after finitude, in order to debunk them in some way. So this idea, you know, that famous part where he has the four kind of people arguing, but of course, you know, these people don't really exist. The strong correlationist, weak correlationist, and so on. But nonetheless, allows him to escape correlationism. So I think rhetoric is quite important to him, and that this book is probably the closest thing he's gotten to a nice and clear and straightforward, concise attempt to sort of undermine his sort of enemies, so to speak. So, of course, really, as I see it, the book is really against the principle of sufficient reason. It's against the idea of necessity, and it's against the idea that, so the classic issue in the early reception of Meillassoux is that he was somehow defending science, that he was finding a way for us to get back to kind of primary qualities and mathematics and so on. But it's quite clear that hyperchaos, the principle that he reaches, the primary absolute, undermines all kind of forms of necessity, and we see this mostly in extra science fiction 2 and 3, where, you know, you get this strange idea that so in the second one, you kind of have to you know, things might happen like acausally, randomly, but it's more, but there would still be some sort of stability, you know. But in extra science fiction 3, you would get like a full kind of hyper chaotic kind of thing. So in extra science fiction world 2, you just have to be vigilant. So the laws will mostly hold, but there will be small things that might change. So you're still in the realm of some sort of science fiction world. There's still some grip on reality. In extra science fiction world kind of 3, well, then you're in Meillassoux' pure kind of territory of, you know, anything could change for no reason whatsoever, which I find kind of interesting because it's a way for him to try to imagine what hyperchaos would actually be like. What would it be like to live in a hyperchaotic world? One in which, say, electricity just like stops working, as he says. So, I mean, mostly I see it as a kind of way for him to imagine fictionally what hyperchaos might actually be like to experience. So instead of the Kantian kind of thing where we just wouldn't be able to represent, it seems Meillassoux believes we would actually be able to kind of live in that world, and that there should be fiction about this. You know, there should be sort of I guess, Hyperstition kind of based books based around this possibility of non-necessity. We live in that kind of world as he sees it. Yeah, so yeah, and just one other thing I want to kind of stress is that doesn't really get brought up in the book, is that in his idea of hyperchaos, we have this idea of there are events within the world that can be defined by a certain amount of possibilities. So a gambler who's throwing a dice knows, you know, a certain amount of things are going to happen. And if the dice keeps landing, as he says, it's very probably loaded. So, but nonetheless, nobody is in the position, and this, I guess, the core Meillassoux point that's kind of missing in the text, is that nobody has the ability to see the set of all natural laws. So nobody is in a position to say what is possible and what is not, in terms of, you know, the world with a small w, as he calls it, and set theoretically, you know, that's also confirmed as he sees it in J.R. Cantor's kind of way. So I guess, yeah, I mean, I don't want to kind of dwell too much in the background of this kind of thing, But as I see it, yeah, it's kind of like his first adventure into trying to imagine what a kind of hyper chaotic world vision might look like, and whether people will kind of take up the mantle of trying to write these kind of texts. What is it like to think without necessity in a very strong sort of way? So I think I'll leave it at that because I don't want to take up too much of your time.
Well, thanks. That was really good. I think actually you actually were in a very short time were able to give a pretty good summary of a lot of the topics we're going to discuss. So if you for one, I would ask if anybody has any questions for you, and then afterwards, if you want to stay, we can like we'll go through it like I guess more step by step, and then maybe pull out some of these things if you'd like.
Sure.
But first, all right, awesome. Does anybody have any questions for Paul? Any Meillassoux general questions that might help? Opening up the floor now for a little bit. Not too long because it's alienating and awkward. Yeah, it was really nice and clear. So Chris also agrees. So okay, take that as a radio silence. I guess. Ben, before we start getting into this, do you want to say anything more about the Humean problem, or of this? He's speaking specifically about Karl Popper and Kant and Hume in this book. So he's renegotiating this problem.
Well, yeah, thanks, Paul. That was really concise and really helpful. One thing that is just interesting, maybe to mention, is that it's quite interesting that Meillassoux sees Hume as, unjustifiably seen, contingency as a psychological problem, as us being subject to the passions, or as he puts it, to desires. What's interesting is that there's these two fighting readings of Hume in the analytic world, which are almost kind of a less extreme version of this. And I wonder if you have anything to say about it, or if anyone else does, that it's often taken like sort of two levels down from what Meillassoux would say, where there's these camps that argue that when Hume is saying that we can't make any causal connection between things, there's camps of people that say he's only talking about language, he's only talking about our ability to represent those changes and talk about them. So it's about things and experiences of things. And there's the other camp, which is represented by someone like Galen Strawson, for instance, who says that actually it's a deeper epistemological problem. It's not restricted to experience, sort of non-experiential things and our experience of them. So I think it's interesting that Meillassoux is kind of this even stronger, is kind of like the next step. Even though it's often presented as a ridiculous reading of Hume, it's actually not that weird when it's put on that spectrum.
Yeah, I think one of Meillassoux' kind of curiosities as a philosopher, one of his, I guess, what makes him the philosopher's philosopher in some sense, is that he refuses, even when he's talking about Popper, and of course he takes Hume's problem from Popper, as in like the actual title, is that there is this sort of idea that the problem is epistemological in some sense. It's just about knowledge, and it's just about over time we will essentially, you know, there's a kind of faith in this in Popper that even if, you know, things kind of, we discover new theories or new laws or whatever, that essentially with time, say Newtonian physics will always stand, and quantum mechanics may come along, they may change things, but nonetheless everything will still sort of, you know, function in some sense, like they'll still be theoretically correct. And I think, yeah, what Meillassoux is kind of saying, and that with this, you know, past, present, and future kind of thing, is that nobody's ever actually really resolved this. It's a, and maybe it's an impossible question. I think that maybe, you know, they say every philosopher picks, you know, one question that they're obsessed with. And I think for Meillassoux, it's that this question is never being answered sort of ontologically. So I tend to sort of agree with him that in that kind of sense, you know, like that it's. But I do sort of feel that it is an impossible sort of question, because we can't, you know, obviously go into the future and find out. But yeah, so I mean, which is what I kind of like about Meillassoux when he says, like, or one of the good things about like his kind of idea of Advent and, like, you know, things happening for no reason and so on, is that it kind of confirms that actually it is the case that we cannot find causal necessity. We cannot. That is the ontological truth of this case. Like, you know, that's generally how I see it, but, you know, it's extremely kind of difficult terrain. I don't know why he picked it. If any philosopher would pick a question, Hume's problem is probably the one to avoid.
So for any other comments or no? All right. So for I guess for the people who haven't not read this, Petra, I don't know if have you read the book we're going to discuss, the extra science fiction?
Oh, sadly, I have not.
Okay, cool.
But
No
I'm
problem.
enjoying anyways.
Yeah, it's actually quite a short text. We've talked about a lot of the. I mean, the premise of it is him. He's discussing. Like, he's discussing science fiction, fictional worlds, because he wants to approach, of course, Hume's problem of induction. Paul's set the tone for us.
Do we all just have hard copies of that?
There are hard copies. Let me just send you really quickly. But I'll send you. There's an article that gives you a lot of the information that's online.
Okay, thanks. Sorry to hold things up.
That's no problem. Think 1 second. I mean, This is actually pretty good. It's pretty good article. It's pretty much this. As Paul said, there's like many different versions of this. There's some 4 or 5 different versions, right? So there's 3 versions published, different, and then this 2 English translations, 2 in French or something. Two. But so he sets up a basic dichotomy between science fiction and extra science fiction, which means he has to define here what his distinction is, and I'm not sure how much we want to go into. I mean, although we probably won't discuss it again. I want to kind of bear with me if you've read the book. I apologize, but I mean, he right in the introduction, he's going to give the difference between the two, and he says right on page 4, in science fiction, the relation of fiction to science seems to be the following. It is a matter of imagining a fictional future of science that modifies and often expands its possibilities of knowledge and mastery of the real. So for Petra, who missed Ben's introduction. This is a lot of Ben isolated the difference between fictional worlds and possible worlds, and a lot of this, I think, plays into also this dichotomy here. So the difference between the fictional and the possible is that. Do you know the distinction, or do you want to do? Would you?
I mean, I wouldn't mind hearing it, but if this is something we've already gone over, I can go back and.
Yeah, I'm just quickly catching you up, so then everybody will be on the same page.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. So he was basically he says possible worlds are worlds envisioned from known possibilities. They're grounded more in imaginary, and fictional worlds are more parasitic on the real world. They're free and open to creation. So science fiction plays a lot in this idea of fictional worlds. There are very similar definitions. Okay, so but I'll continue it with Meillassoux. He says, quote, man's relation to the world undergoes a change by virtue of a modification to scientific knowledge, which opens up unheard of possibilities for him. Whatever upheavals the possible futures introduce, they necessarily stand at the heart of science fiction with the orbit of science. So there's obviously he's giving us the problem of that I think also Ben was trying to introduce to us, which was we're asking a question in this seminar of politics and whether or not a fictional science fiction has to be a politics of science. And here he sort of Meillassoux is obviously grounding science fiction in this science. So. But anyways, it's pretty standard definition. But his definition of fictions of worlds outside science or extra fiction worlds, we are not referring to worlds that are simply devoid of science. He gives the example that they're experimental sciences that in fact do not exist. He gives another example. Worlds in which human beings have not or have not yet developed a scientific relation to the real. So by extra science fiction worlds, we mean worlds where, in principle, experimental science is impossible and not unknown in fact. Extra science fiction thus defines a particular regime of the imaginary in which structured, or rather destructured worlds are conceived in such a way that experimental science cannot deploy its theories or constitute its objects within them. So I just want to say one last thing in his introduction is that he's going to propose his guiding question, and he says the guiding question of extra science fiction worlds is what should a world be, what should a world resemble, so that it is in principle inaccessible to scientific knowledge, so that it cannot be established in the object of a natural science. So these are the two basic concepts. I think and Ben, maybe you want to comment on this, but I think for the start of our session, I think actually this grounding question is it's very much like the one we would like to ask for the next 4 sessions, and kind of around this or playing with it or critiquing it. So I mean, yeah, that's very basic, very simple. So if nobody has any comments on that, we can kind of move on. I don't know if we need to discuss the problem of induction or Popper's view or Kant's view in detail, because maybe we've kind of briefed over it, but I don't know how you guys feel. I mean, it's like the core. It's the explication of these 3 problems are the core of this book. So if we don't, we can basically. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind hearing about. I mean, at least the Kant I find really interesting, that connection. So if anyone has something to say about that, I'd appreciate it.
Okay. I appreciate the feedback. Thank you. It's helpful. Ben, do you want to say something, or you want me to keep going?
I mean, in terms of the Kant discussion in the text.
Yeah, we can talk about his citations of critique of pure reason, pretty much where this is coming from. So I think we can just sort of, yeah, maybe talk about his position, talk about Popper's position, because he's kind of give us leads into extra-science worlds.
Yeah, I mean, as far as Meillassoux argues, right, he says that both Popper and Kant misread Hume's problem, or what Meillassoux sees as Hume's problem. And so, he says that Popper, that Popper just sees it as an epistemological problem. It's just this problem of knowledge, which is, like I mentioned before, you can say it's a problem of knowledge interior to the practice of science, that it's about, our experiences and how we talk about them, or it could be a little bit deeper. It could be what our knowledge is and what is outside of our knowledge. Right? It can be this kind of more extreme view. So it could be like epistemological problem within our knowing, or our knowing and our not knowing. And so Kant's solution, or Kant's version, is that he relies upon the transcendental deduction. He essentially that in order for Kant tries to stop himself from falling into the same skepticism and worry as Hume does about maybe causal connections are just our habit or our perception of them. Kant wants to say no. Reason has a coherency and a strength to it that is guaranteed by the fact that we can know things conceptually is how we combine our intuition, sense and intuition, and that we build concepts out of things to know the world, which is already in a way affected by the world, because it's a synthesis of our experience and what we sense. So in this way, by sort of giving reason this power to synthesize out of what we experience and what seems must be the case about the structure of the world, these kind of a priori assumptions. The transcendental deduction allows Kant to try to sneak around the fact that maybe what we know and what the world is disjunct in a way that would give us serious problems. And Meillassoux sees that as a kind of a cheat. Like he says, and he's not. A lot of people have written about this, that the problem, for Kant is that because reason decides that reason functions and that reason is self-certain in a way, it's actually a bit hard for Kant to justify what the limits of knowing and not knowing are, because our knowledge sort of, because the world is already conceptual as we start to think about it for Kant, that then at what point do you say this is what we don't know yet and what we can't know? Deciding that line becomes very, very tricky. And so Meillassoux thinks that this kind of transcendental move, which he also calls weak correlationism in After Finitude, he thinks that can't be justified. Basically, he thinks there's no kind of basic reasonableness on which Kant can make that deduction, if that makes sense. Hopefully, that was not just rambling. But
it was fairly clear to me. But maybe still adjusting. Yeah, so I guess put the quotes for what he's basically trying to summarize what Ben was saying. click here. So long one. So for those who have read it, like Derek, if you wouldn't mind, maybe did you find it interesting, or did you find
Oh yeah, sure. Sorry,
like,
it's yeah. I mean, the Popper thing. I'm trying to remember what Popper had to say about possible worlds. Was it a kind of like lexical thing about the language of science? Is that where he is with possible worlds?
I believe so. I'm trying to find that citation. Actually, it's not in the book, but
No.
I don't know. I'm not a Popper expert, but I'm.
Yeah, I mean, neither am I. I'm just trying to get a sense of things. But I mean, the thing that I'm kind of most interested in is maybe jumping like too far in. But the type 3 world that Meillassoux describes, this kind of fiction that he kind of uses to exemplify the type 3. It's like I don't know, like a romantic catastrophe or something. It kind of electricity stops working. That's hyper chaos. Is that? It doesn't seem particularly like. I mean, I guess it's a fairly chaotic thing to happen. But is that the type 3 or is that the type 2? I can't remember that either.
I would think that the electricity stopped working is actually type 2, right? Because it's not completely outside of our.
That's what I was trying to remember. But I'm
3.
like it's a 3 is the example. This is the hyper chaotic kind of situation. But we can still, we're not totally estranged by it. So this kind of definition of science fiction that he uses as well. I mean, there are others which are the literature of cognitive estrangement or something. So it's like it's not as chaotic it's not as hyper chaotic as I might have assumed. Is that there? I mean, is that?
No, I mean, actually, I would think it's more of a 2, but I guess it's so. Paul,
I guess in the type 2, it seems that things kind of fracture and fragment. You get pockets, so you might get a kind of a localized electrical failure, but not a kind of complete collapse of electricity. The possibility of electricity doesn't cease in type 2. It starts to kind of fade or something. I don't know. I'm kind of quite curious about how these things get demarcated in this sort of 1, 2, and 3, and how close maybe the type 1 is I guess how it might. I'm not even sure I can say the word, but correlate with where we are now. These are the sort of questions that I have after I only read the book this morning, so those questions are the ones that came to me. Sorry if that's kind of too much all of a sudden.
Well, I think the next step would be. I mean, the next step would be, if we don't. I don't know if we're not gonna spend too much time discussing the Popper Kant Hume thing, because we can go back and read it, and I pretty much do want to jump right into the 3 worlds, so we can just kind of go over the 2, and then maybe once we kind of brush back over it in this, we can then approach that question again and think, and maybe think about it. So for the people who have not read this book or haven't read any of the other versions, the Type 1 worlds, Type 1 worlds are worlds which are outside of science, but they do not, they're not, they don't destroy science or endanger science, he says. Because he says that he says, I quote, that science is structurally indifferent to events that can give place only to a testimony and not to a protocol of observation. So, so the first type of world is I mean, I think the first type of world is very close to a sci-fi. He doesn't give. Does he give an example? Let me think. Of like an actual story. No. But he does say, quote, "For science, every phenomenon that is punctually causeless would either be non-existent or not have a demonstrable cause. Thus, it would have no consequence for science's existence. One would live in a universe where alongside an unimpaired sphere of events, quote, for scientists, unquote, which can be reproduced at will in the laboratory." This is so he's talking. I mean, there he's citing Popper, but I probably shouldn't have quoted that. But I'm trying to sort of think of something that we can classify what the first extra fiction world is, and looking to Ben or Paul or anybody that has an example. I want to say it's close. I mean, I want to say it's close to Annihilation, but I think Annihilation is closer to 2 than 1.
Yeah,
I think I might have froze.
at which point to mention Annihilation.
Oh yeah. Paul, have you read Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer by any chance?
Me, sir?
Yeah, I mean, or anybody, but yeah, I know a few of us have because it was in the first session.
Well, I guess when it comes to the 3 types of worlds, this also reminds me of his divine existence, which has this kind of qualitative leaps, things that just kind of happen for no reason, that kind of stuff, So I think like science fiction or extra science fiction world or type world 1, I think he's essentially saying, yeah, that's a science fiction, it's nothing too drastic, and he skips by it quite fast, I think, in the second one, I think in
go ahead. Sorry.
But I think at least in the just going by this from kind of the background of his work, it's a classic kind of Meillassoux thing, like the tripartite kind of structure, where he's leading you to the eventual drastic one, So type 2 world is where you're getting very close to a world that science can still function, but nonetheless, strange things will still happen, Whereas 3 is very much the kind of like hyper chaos. And one of the only kind of things I don't like about the book is how short type 3 worlds get treated. He actually gives a very, very short kind of shrift, really, and gives only one example. But yeah, I think extra science fiction world 2 and 3 are sort of his kind of like hyper chaotic sort of worlds. One in which it's kind of like mild hyper chaos, and 3 where it's pure kind of hyper chaos. But I wouldn't know enough about sort of like fiction in general to kind of have like kind of good examples, to be honest.
Yeah, I think the basic thing is type 1 I mean, type 1 could even be our world in a sense, right? Because he kind of claims that things happen that, if they were true, would threaten science. But he says, that might be unreliable witnesses, or there might be something that maybe upset science, but it happens here or there. And where he says, like type 2, he says the irregularities are so frequent that they would, or so, drastic that they would destroy science, and then the third type destroys consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right,
like that's one, yeah, and like that's one question I have, and I've talked about this with Tony already, like, and actually, Tristan Garcia mentioned this as well. That one problem he has is how do you separate the notion of sense, or how does Meillassoux relate sense and consciousness, and sense in terms of narration, and that if you had a story that represented type 3 worlds, I mean, is the assumption that to represent a type 3 world, you couldn't do it within a type 3 world? Or if you had a representation of a type 3 world in a type 3 world, would it just be, what would that be? And I wonder if that's partially the reason he doesn't talk about it so much, because, or why even his example is not that extreme. Because it begs the question a bit, is if consciousness is destroyed, what is a book? Basically, I think is something to ask there.
Sure, and I think like that's the reason why he chooses a type an extra fiction 2 world to describe the most. Because if you look at one of the quotes that I pointed to the right, when he's defining, the second world, is that they're necessary to abolish science, right? But consciousness stays. You said this, and then but they're genuine, but he says that it's a world in which we can only chronicle things, and this is the idea of narration. It's sufficient to abolish science, but the only science that sort of stays around or is kept that we've talked about is history, in the sense.
Yeah.
So this one holds up to fiction, or fiction that we could read or create or write. But the third is quite almost, it seems impossible, right?
Yeah, there's also the discussion between him and Florian Hecker, which this text appeared first in the that speculative solution CD, and they ask him what is sort of like Meillassoux, what is his aesthetic vision, and it would be to go to the world of desubjectivated matter, and come back, called to Hell's realm or Death's realm, and all this kind of stuff. And so, I mean, there is that kind of sense of whether the idea is that his ultimate sort of aesthetic vision would be sort of the ability of consciousness to somehow travel to that kind of, desubjectivated sort of world and escape consciousness briefly and then sort of come back,
But he doesn't. But he still in this book he's kind of left off without really explaining the conditions of the third of XSF3, right?
Mm-hmm.
So look at if this is like right at 43. Saying that for first of all, so on 44, first of all, let's try to understand more precisely what extra science fiction tale should be. It has to obey 2 requirements. A, within it, events take place that that no real or imaginary logic can explain, and B, the questions of science is present in the tale, albeit in a negative mode. So we have to be dealing with the world in which science suddenly becomes or is the course of becoming impossible, either entirely or partially. So yeah, I guess we can to briefly run back through, I guess, the modes of fiction that he's talking about, right? You have science fiction, which is grounded around questions of science. You have extra science fiction world one, which is basically science fiction indifferent to science. You have science fiction, or have extra science fiction world two, which is incoherent logic, or something that threatens to abolish science or does abolish science. However, occurrences or history remains, events remain that can be told. And then you have the third world, in which it's devoid of all necessary laws, and therefore it's no longer a world. He says this. It would be a universe in which disorderly modifications are so frequent that, following the example of chaos described by Kant in the objective deduction, the conditions of science as well as those of consciousness would be abolished. So the second world, yes, the second world, the other point is that we discussed is that the second world abolishes science but not consciousness, and the third world abolishes both. So this brings us back to the question of, can you think anything outside of thought, right? I mean, can you think the outside of thought? Would you be thinking the extra science fiction world 3? I don't have an answer to, but it's interesting speculation, and I wish I wish some sort of prototype could come, or we could think of. Well, then, yeah. So that you end up in an endless loop if you can retain order of events, then you're retaining consciousness. Therefore, it's extra science fiction too. Anytime you have an event. So this is the problem. So because you can narrate the fact. So the question, to go back to Derek's question, is the fact that you can even narrate the sense that electricity stops working. It therefore has to be. I mean, if you can recount the events, is that therefore not really the third world? Or is there something more in Meillassoux that I'm missing, like where this example of electricity is used again? Or is it only brought up here? Or is it brought up in Hyperchaos?
Only there, right there.
Only here?
Yeah. So, this is one of his main problems with his books, is that they always end on a kind of whether it's after finitude, this book, or whether it's the number and the siren, you're always left with like more questions than answers. That's kind of his thing, you know.
Sure. Yeah. But very, very, very clear writing, which is like I'm not used to it with the French writers. I mean, translations at least. I mean, clear and concise, but very open to tons of questions. We had a bunch of notes. I mean, I mean, we've pretty much, in a weird piecemeal, like roundabout, going back and forth way, we've discussed like the basics of this book. And I recommend, for those who haven't read The Billiard Ball, which is a very short story, I have a post on the classroom. I actually have like a collection of his essays, but it's inside of that collection, where you can read this this short story, which is a good example of this fiction, or the second example, right? So in this example, the potential murder occurs, right, where the billiard ball ends up going right through the character's body and ends up killing him in the end. they're trying to, in the story, they're trying to create an anti-gravity. There's one character who's theorized, who has theories of anti-gravity, and there's another character who is a very pragmatic sort of doer who challenges him to, and this theory is claimed that it cannot actually occur, and so he's challenged to create this anti-gravity machine. And so in the story, the scientific logic, obviously, is sort of suspended here. However, you actually have this journalist narrator who's trying to recount the events and retell the events and put some sort of logic to it. Therefore, it falls into the extra science fiction 2 world, right? And I don't know. If anybody has any that has read the Billiard Ball, has anything that they like questioned about it, or maybe its categorization in his extra science taxonomy, or anything, or Ben, if you have anything else, because I'm kind of rambling right now. I mean, the hardest thing is, I guess, sort of sitting here to classify these systems. We can give a bunch of examples. I think you have Billiard Ball, but if annihilation is a different example, I think annihilation is a good example of, or I think some parts of annihilation is a good example of extra science fiction 2 world, because you have all of these characters, all of which use scientific method or the experimental method as their logic of discovery. You have, and they're all inside of this. There are what is California, which is now called Area X, and they're experiencing all of these different events that are occurring that they can't logically, apply science to. So they have a lighthouse in which they can't logically measure with their scientific tools the lighthouse. The lighthouse also is inverted and grows down into the earth. So you have a sort of break with science, however, sort of have a ethical, ecological consciousness that's sort of like the driving force of annihilation. Let me look. I mean, so we could. I mean, the things we did skip over, Ben, was a little bit in the introduction. We skipped a little bit over this sort of difference between philosophy and literature. I guess that we might be able to we can push towards the end or something. Or you talked a little bit about the epistemological ontological distinction. Let me just. The question I think that we really wanted to explore was this idea of narration that comes in at the end of this book. But I mean, if nobody's read it or wants to contribute, we can move on.
I mean, could someone say something about the idea of chronicling as maybe like the relation between chronicling and narrating? It's a Meillassoux term. Is this right? It's like part of his technical terminology, the idea of the chronicle.
I would ask all that actually.
Is that
I'm
right?
not the Meillassoux expert.
Not really.
Right.
I mean, he does have one other book, The Number and the Siren, which kind of attempts to decipher a Mallarmé poem and all this kind of stuff. But from just talking to people in general, they tend to think that he has kind of rhetorical aspect to him. There is some sort of like chronology going on, especially in his history of philosophy. It's very short and concise and so on. whether it plays a major role in this kind of context, and I would be hesitant to say directly, which makes it, that's why it's kind of an unusual Meillassoux text, you know, because he actually is talking about sort of us humans in this very kind of you know, and this earlier texts like After Finitude, you know, are kind of sort of nihilistic, kind of dark, you know. Divine existence, there's like a lot of talk of human dignity and so on, and hope in the future. But I wouldn't say narration is one of his kind of it's more something that seems to be implicit in his work rather than he is explicitly, you know, kind of like focused on that as an area. But it does seem to be a theme running through his work. Is probably the best answer I can give to that.
Okay.
I would say, like, I mean, doesn't his thing with contingency would play a huge role in this if we're thinking of narration as history.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think this is like these things like consistently come up, and so I don't know if we can if like I mean, when he's talking about extra science fiction too, he's saying that we can chronicle these things, but they no longer have universal properties, right? They no longer have scientific natural causes, or
I think
it would just be in the fact that we can record contingency, right? We can experience it, record it.
A huge sort of aspect in his work, which is about the fact that although we seem to have a desire for necessity and narration, say, you know, some sort of linearity, we wish the world had some sort of direction or whatever, you know. And he kind of seems interested in the fact that so for him, yeah, kind of necessity is kind of like a stand-in for narration or chronicle. It's something we clearly desire, but that he doesn't believe in. But nonetheless, he recognizes that it's a temptation of the human.
Mm-hmm. Right. The metaphor uses the accident of things. So yeah. Chris had a question. I think that actually it was very close. Quote. So if narrative has an illimitable role in such circuitry as it is in part because the libidinal engagement of a storyline has an essential motivating role. What's the story is always a question that's always there. And temptation of human. Great phrase, yeah. So, where, Chris, if you're around, where is this quote
Sorry,
from?
this is from the Hyperstition blog.
Yeah.
I was just taking some notes, so I'm sorry. I'm kind of digesting.
No problem. This is from the CCRU collection.
No, this is from the Hyperstition blog itself. I at one point PDF'd, or I copied and pasted everything I could find that was once there into a PDF. If you guys want that, it's black on white instead of orange on whatever black. But anyway, I think it's a really interesting question, and one I've been wrestling with, because it's so important, I think, to have a narrative that is captivating enough to where you can, you know, maybe insert more didactic or explanatory inferences about worlds or what a world may or may not be. So it's a very interesting intersection for me personally, but I don't know. I just think, actually, just writing on Hyperstition, which I've been doing a little bit of over the last year or two. I always keep "What's the story" on a yellow note on my laptop. I get posted because it's really important, I think, to have a good narrative. Like, we all love time travel films, I'm sure, but like, and plot holes can be productive, but they can also not be hooks from the future. So.
And that is one of the questions I think that we're trying to generally frame is really that you're touching on is how does hyperstition complicate the relation between fictional and possible that we're setting up here, and it's exactly this sort of I don't know if it's exactly, but to put it in your sense, we need this sort of narrative, and the hyperstition is sort of like it sort of creates its own premises in regards to sort of or politics. Is what Ben and I were talking or discussing when we were thinking about this. So, so yeah, the questions of cyberpositivity and possible worlds, quite interesting, I think. And Ben, if you want to chime in, maybe.
Well, I mean, it's kind of it's a turn back to, it's a way of kind of taking Hume's original reading and pushing it forward in an interesting way, right? Instead of saying it's not that our passions or desires have us treat the relationship between causes and experiences in a way that's comfortable for us, but it's actually embracing like unavoidability of of desires themselves having a causal factor beyond just making sense of the world, that it's actually even more deeply structured into how we think anything, even the potential thinkable, kind of a way of reading Cyberpod there. That's like, it's not, we have a desire to make sense of things, but our desire itself makes sense of things in a way that's not sensible. So it'd be kind of like a land would be a weird way of seeing land as like Hume's passionate revenge on Meillassoux or something. Maybe that's a bit too weird. I don't know.
I think Chris is sharing the document. I think we have about an hour, with a little bit over an hour left. So if we could, at this point, let's take a quick 10-minute break, and we can come back at 1/2 past, and we'll kind of try to work out some general questions, and then finish out this session with some of the general themes and stuff we want to discuss, and maybe learn a little bit about the people in the seminar, like what their actual interests are, so we can direct discussion easier for the next sessions. But so let's meet back here in 1/2 past. We'll take a 10-minute break. Okay. All right, I guess if we can all let me know if you're back. We can start. We can start again. We just have like, yeah, roughly an hour. Derek's here.
Yep, I'm here.
Petra's here. Ben's here. Okay. The rest have been kind of like that since the beginning. So, Ben, I don't know if you got my message, but you want. I'm sorry, Petra.
Paul left?
Oh, Paul. Yeah, Paul had to go because it's late.
Oh, okay.
So if we have any other further questions with Paul, we can post it on the classroom. We can shoot it to him. I can invite him in. He can finish up the discussions. I think, but yeah, it was getting late there, so he needed to go. Yeah, he stayed a lot longer than he expected, so that was quite nice. He had a good time.
Cool.
So, we did talk. I mean, like, so we did. I think keeping these ideas in mind, we did talk about. We did put another story, which is short. It's like 13 pages. We put it on. We put it on the classroom as well, and I think this. I don't know if anybody has read it, so we can kind of push the story, like talking about the story itself, to the classroom, and maybe have discussion there. But it did bring up some points, I think, that Ben and I were discussing just before the session, and I think maybe laying them out just to kind of give some last minute thoughts on Meillassoux. Try to have a quick discussion if people are available and want to talk, and not or post it in the chat as well if you don't want to speak. Like, and I think so. What we found with the story was this Connie Willis story. The Schwarzschild radius is the story, and so when we were talking earlier with Ben and I, Ben found that Ben was brought to the table the first, formally, sort of the way that she's presenting the story. There's these slowly contracting metaphors in which you have sort of reality and scientific experience. Well, like they're held apart at one point, right? And then there's these two sorts of things, reality and experience, scientific experience, whatever you want, empirical experience, starts to close in the story until there's literally sort of no gap, or there's indistinction between what is reality, what is scientific experience. I think this is kind of interesting, right? Because in a lot of perhaps I don't want to say all science fiction, but maybe modernist science fiction, which we were talking, usually holds these two separately in order to sort of, I mean, they hold them separately at a distance in order to sort of compel distinctions between them, correct? I'd like to make political statements about these two things. And so her story is her story sits, I think, in this sense, it's a little bit outside of at least Meillassoux' definition here, a little bit. But I don't know, like Ben, I don't know if because this counterpoint that I was going to explain, if I'm going over our outline, is your point. So if you want to talk about it, I don't want
to. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting how she does this, because it's often with sort of phrases that that become closer together, where it's like these repetitions of frozen, right? Frozen in terms of a frozen image, and then frozen is then being frozen on the front, and then it's like can't get messages out. This idea of redshift, or things being red, like this medicine makes his vision red, and then redshifting stars. And then the idea of like scientific theories and personal theories about what happened, right? So things kind of slowly, and safe distance, right? This idea of safe distance and being an observer. So it kind of funnels together towards the end. And so what's interesting is that on the one hand, I think she's kind of saying, you can't separate sort of reality and the creation of science, by the idea that scientific, that there's something about these kind of scientific concepts which are not created in like a purely scientific realm, that they're very much bound to sense and experience, and which is kind of an obvious statement on the one hand, but it's kind of interesting that she's challenging this. What I think Meillassoux would want to separate. It's kind of that you can have sense or narration without science, and science without, or even science without particular kinds of narration. And she metaphorically wants to collapse these. So on the one hand, it could be seen as a challenge to Meillassoux in the way she uses metaphor, but on the other hand, it could be seen that science is just narration, that sense and experience are all what science is, and that can easily fall apart. So I think it depends on how you read the story, and especially the last kind of statement, right, where the character who has talked about all these horrible things that happened on the front of World War I. And this, kind of naive person interviewing him, saying how surprised he was that Schwarzschild could create these mathematical theories for how event horizons form on black holes, while suffering from this disease and being under siege. That, which on the one hand is like, how could anyone think scientifically in those conditions, but also how could but of course, there's a kind of tongue-in-cheek comment she's making, that the idea of a black hole and the experience of war can be tied together in some kind of affective sense, but also at the same time that these kind of notions that scientific creations can change the way we view experience as such. So I think it's a very interesting, what the story does conceptually is very complicated. And this kind of further complicates this relationship between science and narrative.
I was just gonna say I haven't read that, but in relation to what, or just from the context you gave in relation to what Tony raised regarding cyberpositivity and fictioneering, I think it's really interesting to think about what fictions are worth transmuting into the domains of nonfiction, or what we think we know. And like, it is most interesting, or it's often most compelling when it comes from very fathomable, insane situations like the one you just described. So I don't know. Just putting that out there. But yeah, regarding cyberpositivity, sorry, I didn't really follow that through. Regarding autocatalytic, like self-organizing systems, there's a certain way that you can't talk about, or there's a certain way that you can't explain them away, or even, like, they use you more than you use them, kind of thing. I don't know. It's difficult.
No, I think because when we were trying to contextualize this before the session, we could see, when we can see like Ray Brassier's critique of Len coming up, but then we can think of cyberpositivity and sort of like, like we were saying, like Amy Ireland's sort of position on these sort of runaway processes, and I think you fall I think close to sort of Amy's position as well.
Definitely.
And
I will make sure that that is recorded forever. Definitely.
So
sorry. So yeah, so it gets interesting to me. I mean, we can talk about acceleration or capital, I think, as one of these narratives pretty easily. But it doesn't mean it's like really. So where do you hedge your bets then? I'm still working this out, but yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, inside of this realm, you have Mark Fisher's Capital Realism, right? That's talking that, I mean, there is possibility with, I think one way to read it maybe in what we're talking about is that if you have capitalist narrative or narration or is our story, then if we're thinking possible possible worlds are being exhausted in sort of like in Fisher's sort of Children of Men example.
Yeah, I still haven't read that book actually. I should. But yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's talking about in a different sense that Bifo is talking about, and After the Future, they're talking about very much similar, very much similar stories with regards to capital, like modernism. I don't know what you want to call it, modernity, or capital as like the ultimate grand narrative, exhausting all like our ability to even imagine a future, which is sort of the exhaustion of possibility, maybe. Or Ben might want to
Sorry, I
correct me.
was talking about capital in like Thomas Piketty's sense, strictly. So
Okay.
like, no, I was joking. Sorry, I didn't like that.
When we talked about so Paul also brought up he sort of talked a little bit about facticity, which is a very important concept in Meillassoux, and so one thing I think one thing is actually quite interesting that we were Ben and I were speaking about earlier, was it, and you sort of touched on it. You're talking about these things sort of being frozen on the horizon. So even if the object is sort of there, you sort of have this informational point of view on ontology that we're just like slowly treading it in, bringing it in, and one interesting relation to this sort of informational ontology, or whatever you might want to call it, is that it's has an interesting correlation with the way that Meillassoux is sort of reading Hume, and I don't know if anybody has anything like. So I think like all like this, obviously the informational view on ontology is very much related to, I think, this cyberpositivity.
In what way?
So so if we're sort of like we're left to treat the world as sort of like um, sort of information, and it sort of doesn't matter like how like ontologically sort of how this world manifests itself. This is what we were discussing, right, Ben? But there's sort of the ways in which we can sort of read them. Yeah, so please help me out, Ben. I've
yeah,
been
I
talking
mean,
too long. Sorry.
no, I think yeah, I mean, one of the things in Meillassoux is if and partly it's how do you read the relationship between epistemology and ontology, and So on the one hand, if you say, there's this kind of hyper chaos is possible, or there's these, things could happen, things could change without any reason, then it becomes very difficult, right, to draw the line between unknowable based on what we have for science now, and what's absolutely unknowable, right? And so Meillassoux wants to claim that rationality, in particular mathematics, gives us some privileged access to the absolute, right? To some privileged access to the real. So if you take him on his word for that, you say, okay, we have certain logical access, we have some way of reading what occurs, even if what occurs is, almost totally crazy. And this goes back to the question of narration, right? Narration would remain, or does narration remain in even the most chaotic world? Then in this sense, it doesn't really matter if you treat ontology and epistemology differently, because whatever traces you can pick up from the kind of chaotic world is what there is. Because even if there is some gap between being and knowing, it doesn't really matter, because if it changes, you don't really know which one changed. Right? So in a way, in what we were talking about earlier, is sort of how this relates to in the Connie Willis story, when she talks about the Schwarzschild radius, this idea that an object could, if an object fell into a black hole, it would appear as just this kind of smear of information on the edge. But then you could still read and know everything about the object, even though it had been destroyed, right? Even though it would appear frozen to us, even though it was completely gone. And so there's this sort of kind of interesting relationship between, or there's this kind of then consequent idea that the world becomes informational. And I mean, you can read this in various other ways of looking at physics, not just in terms of philosophy, but also in terms of whether you want to read things like, how you want to read the arrow of time, or how you want to read something like thermodynamics in terms of actual physical processes, or just in terms of information. Like if you can always get information off of something even after it's destroyed, then are certain processes reversible. So, I don't know, in a way, it seems like there's kind of informationalization of being in Meillassoux, if that makes sense.
Okay. I guess it's sort of helpful also in the way he. Sorry, I'm kind of breaking up, I think, on this, but the idea of chronicling something seems to me. I mean, what Paul was saying about the kind of rhetorical nature of the texts, not necessarily this extra science fiction, but perhaps after finitude. But the idea of chronicling is a strict recording of a timeline rather than a kind of narrating. I think it seems to be kind of one is maybe more informational than the other. One is kind of stricter. It's a kind of stream, fixed points, known marks, rather than a kind of narration.
It's very interesting to think about that, and as you said earlier, to paraphrase you, don't want to correlate, but it's interesting to take Meillassoux' three worlds, or four, and flip them back on science, I think. Like, to think of scientific interests and explanations as the disaster, burlesque nonsense, and what was the third? I'm sorry. I can't remember, but I think it's interesting to think about how you would categorize potential engendering, self-engendering worlds back on what we know is absolute due to the arch fossil. But I don't know. I don't know much about science.
It is an interesting question. I just also don't have any expertise to answer that exactly. It's a good question.
I think it's a fertile thing, though. I think we could very easily do readings of published, expensive, JSTOR access only scientific papers via these categories, and it would probably be really revealing and interesting. People are all about disaster scenarios, so Yellowstone, whatever the Seattle earthquake thing is. And I don't know if you'd call that science because it hasn't happened yet, but I don't know. It's definitely in the domain of, or the realm of that.
I think so, and I also think to sort of you're talking about the disasters. I think also it brings us to another important question for the seminar, or important maybe relation for the seminar that we could think about, which is its relation to sort of how we could think of these things in terms of ecological thought, I think, as well. And we can think about we have a distinction between well, it's a rough one. It's not, but it's a global anthropolitics and an earth politics that maybe Ben can explain to us in a second. But I think you have Eugene Thacker's newest book. You have Book World Without Us. And Book World Without Us is actually sort of a fictional science, right? I think. So somewhat, I guess, is getting closer to what you're asking.
Yeah, that book was cool. I had it in college. I haven't looked at it recently.
Yeah,
I really don't remember.
I haven't looked at it recently either. I was just thinking.
Yeah, well, I don't think science is dominated by apocalyptic pursuits, but yeah, it is interesting how it triggers maybe the desire to resharpen or to set aside a compulsion towards resolving, I don't know, ecological threats, but also, I don't know, I don't even know. I don't know.
You broke up for that last part, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, sorry, internet's not good.
You mentioned an example before that one, Tony?
Before World Without Us?
Yeah. What was that?
Eugene Thatcher's
Right.
Planet.
Can you say more about what appears in that text to demonstrate what
So I'm gonna I think the basics, and then I sort of want Ben to chime in because I think he'll have a good answer, or somewhat. But these are speculative questions about whether or how we construct fictional worlds, or we think of possible worlds, and the question that we were that Eugene Thacker's doing is asking, does it even make sense to, so sort of like the pessimistic, it's all about pessimism, right? So it's a pessimistic viewpoint of, does it even make sense to devise a world without us? if you're thinking in the ecological mindset, is it because does it make sense to devise a world because it would be better off without us? Humans would just destroy the world, or so like these sorts of, I think these sorts of speculations are maybe not exactly related to these categories of extra science fiction that we're talking about, but they're related to questions of fictional worlds and possible futures that we hope to sort of explore throughout the whole session.
Okay, I see.
Or
Thank you.
the four sessions, sorry. But
Right.
Ben might have an addendum.
Well, no, I was just gonna say, like, like part of that text, this idea that like the human concept of world may be incompatible with the longevity or functionality of the planet, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this idea that, you have world as a concept that has human use, but that even that concept may do damage to the planet, whereas the planet may be totally indifferent
Right.
to us and our world. So
Yeah. And I think maybe if like the way that text ends is he says something to the effect of like maybe all that's left is to think in the dust of this planet or something like that, like exit the world and I don't know, enter the dust.
yeah, because I think
As thought, like yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, he talks about. I think he ends with William Hope Hodgson's story, like the one about when what's left of humanity is like living in a giant steel pyramid.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And it's for like the last refuge, and it's just about the kind of the futility of that, of like the fact that eventually the planet or the sun, some conditions will change, and that it will be inhospitable for us.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's something like thought requires a concept of world that the planet doesn't really care, and so what does that mean for philosophy? And it's the sort of his kind of jury conclusion is it's probably not good for us.
Yeah.
And a great point just got brought up on the sidebar, I think, also, or a great question, which is that this sort of thinking Eugene's work, whether it relates directly to, bringing it back to Meillassoux text, if we can think of it as a type 3 world. So I think for sure a world without us is a world without consciousness, which is without human consciousness. However we might want to defining it in Meillassoux sense, consciousness. And maybe it is a way of sort of getting us closer to type 3, maybe.
Well, it's interesting to ask about the relationship between Meillassoux saying, right, that the world, then type 3 worlds, consciousness would be impossible, or it could be impossible for consciousness to form.
Right.
As opposed to having the destruction of human consciousness, maybe even willfully, or unavoidable over time for Eugene.
Okay.
And the relationship between those, I think, is interesting. Especially in terms of fictional versus possible, right? In terms of what can be represented and what could be acted upon. And whether there might be political reasons for destroying consciousness or something. It's like an ecological choice, destroying consciousness, as opposed to it not being possible.
It's so interesting because it'll happen eventually. I love Brassier's point in Nihil Unbound that extinction is literally unthinkable because there won't be someone there to think it. It's like literally so absurd a gesture because it's literally unimaginable because there's no one. It's not in the realm of language. There's literally no one you would want to talk about that with if you happen to witness it. You know. Yeah, it's interesting.
I think in a sense that's I mean that. So it's not exactly in this category, but it is sort of like it's an off variant of a way of thinking a world, or thinking what might be a world in which it's a type 3 world.
Does Meillassoux say, I think maybe I heard somebody mention this earlier, but does Meillassoux kind of like articulate the difference between what we can speak about and what we can think about when it comes to like a world without us? Like extinction, there would be nothing to speak about, as Chris mentioned, but there is something to think about. Maybe, I don't know. So for Meillassoux, like language being the limit versus the realm of possibility of thinking being the limit. Does that question make any sense?
So Meillassoux doesn't discuss the world without us technically. He discusses human finitude, and he does discuss this problem from what I know is that you can't. So it's in Meillassoux it's that you cannot think your way out of. For me, it's strong. It's very weird, but you cannot think your way out of thinking. And this is that circular point, I think, that we're always coming around. I think when we're trying to, for instance, the whole 4 sessions we just did, where we were trying to pin down, I think, Hyperstition. Now we're trying to pin down what this type 3 world might be, or what the conditions might be. And I think it's sort of this is the in a way you can say this is like a strong correlationism that that Meillassoux just like embraces rather than but I could be wrong. I don't know if anybody else is. Tell me I'm wrong. It's fine.
By strong correlationism, I think what I think that means is like what can't be spoken of, can't be thought, or something, or what? Like what is? In what sense is it stronger than like the typical Kantian correlationism?
Because weak correlationism is generally Kant, the idea that we only have access to our concepts of things, but there are things in themselves, but we can't know them. Whereas the strong version, which is which for Meillassoux is pretty much everyone after German idealism onward, is just that there's not even things in themselves. So it's not that there's stuff out there that we can't know, that we only know directly. It's that all what we know is what there is. So it's like, yeah, there's not even we shouldn't even talk about things in themselves or things outside of knowing.
Ben, I can't remember. Does math break the correlationism cycle, or is it strong? Do you remember? Like mathematical facts. In After Finitude.
I mean, from what I remember, it's just that, math is a kind of example of how we can kind of, because he doesn't say we can escape strong correlationism. He basically says we should embrace it and kind of turn it against itself.
Right.
So, which, as far as I remember, math is that kind of an example of this, right? And and I think one place, Petra, in terms of language, and I don't know the text well enough to talk about it, but in the Mallarmé text that Paul mentioned, The Number and the Siren, from what I know about it, Meillassoux does attempt to try to say how discussion of number in this kind of this mode of deciphering Mallarmé's poem is in talking about number and talking about the way numbers function. Meillassoux kind of argues it's a performative act more than a representational one. So that like the idea of doing maths or pursuing a logic is like a demonstration of a sort of strong correlation, but that means more than, it's not about representing, it's not about us and the world, it's about this act of that's absolute, or this act that has truth in it. And so that he kind of talks about it in this performative sense. So that might be something to look into, but like I don't know that text well at all, so I can't. Yeah.
That's interesting. It almost.
Sorry.
Go ahead. I'll let us move on.
I was just wanting to the text that you distributed, one of the kind of background texts where you talk about the ineffable, creation and the ineffable. I think that would be. Yeah, that. Right. I just thought it was quite a helpful background text. I didn't know whether maybe this idea of creation, we've talked a lot about kind of ends in a way with type 3 worlds, but is there a way of thinking about the type 3 world as creative?
Yeah. It's that what we discussed already in terms of the idea of talking about type 3 worlds from within our world, or type 3 worlds within themselves. Because it seems impossible to talk about type 3 worlds within type 3 worlds, because it might just, because we couldn't even say what would be sense or nonsense. But in terms of, I think if there would be a creative act for talking about type 3 worlds in our worlds in the term of narrating a type 3 world from a type 1 world or whatever, or maybe we could say our world. Maybe Meillassoux wouldn't even want to talk about the real world as type 1. It seems like there could be a creative function in that, a type 3 world, if you could have, a type 3 world so structurally different, you could have this representation of a world without consciousness that in some way would infect our consciousness. That would be creative, and that would be creative in an actually novel way. And this is kind of what Paul was saying, that Meillassoux' aesthetic dream is that if we could visit hyperchaos for a weekend and come back, and that our neural architecture would be indelibly changed in a productive way. Maybe that's one way of thinking about it. Because otherwise, within a type 3 world itself, it's hard to say what creation would be if there's no consciousness. Since it's hard for me to say how you measure creation without consciousness, or without any kind of structure whatsoever. Yeah.
Thanks.
So we have about 30 minutes, and I guess we can open it up to any last minute discussions on the book, the concepts, anything on Meillassoux at all that might relate or have any interest to our discussions. and after, if there is a discussion, after that we'll just briefly just describe some of the questions that we might want to start framing for the next 3 sessions as we read these texts. And then we'll kind of do it in a backward sense. We'll like, I want to ask a few that I don't know, I mean, to sort of introduce themselves and sort of maybe tell us a little bit why this seminar is of interest to you, like you're working on a project or you have some interest, and so that way it'll better allow us to frame the next sessions, and then we'll be done for the day. So just my European people, just 20 more minutes. You know, it's 1 o'clock for Ben right now. So yeah, I mean, just to, does anybody have any last thoughts or questions? Again, if you want to go back and post these on the classroom, we can as well. We can move into the general framework of the seminar. Okay. So when Ben and I were coming together to kind of do this seminar, as we said, like the way he introduced it was basically contextualizing his talk that he gave in Melbourne. It was kind of a lot that influenced the seminar, along with the previous one that we did on New Weird Fiction and Hyperstition. And this one we wanted to focus a lot more on reading the fictional works. Today we did a lot more theory than I think we expected. So we can now prepare these texts. They're all pretty short. We paired them with some philosophical texts or theoretical texts. The next session will be on possible worlds, just the first chapter of Lewis' book, and try to get through as much as you can of Miavel's City in the City, and we'll kind of try to pull apart possible worlds throughout this book. So the third session will be Michael Sisko's Member, which we were supposed to read in the last session. We never got to, so we really wanted to bring it up. We read that along what are the text that we paired Sisko with?
It's Marcus Gabriel's.
Oh yes, The World Does Not Exist.
Yeah.
So that's a new book, just came out recently. So hopefully, if you guys can get it, if you can't, I should be getting my I have a copy coming very soon. But there's a TED Talk actually that he did that I posted that kind of gives you the premise of like the questions that we will be asking. And I'll post excerpts from it when I have the book for us to read and share. The final session will be Kodwa Eshin's work, kind of discuss Mark Derry's. We put the interview with Mark Derry in there as well, to kind of talk about maybe Afrofuturism and these and maybe this sort of relation. And I think, and then in there's also Philip K. Dick stories coming. I think they're in the third and the fourth session. So, with that said, though, that's the text that we have chosen. And if anybody has text that they think is quite interesting to the topics, or any previous topics, please post them on Classroom or at least a citation, and we can discuss them in here. We're not limited to discussing just what Ben and I picked, but hopefully people can contribute what they find interesting or what they're working on. I would honestly really like this seminar to be like by Virginia. Nice for you to be here. Thank you. I would like for the seminar to really be useful for everybody to really push what they're working on, and we can sort of workshop ideas. and really not to be afraid to sort of say something that you're not 100% like sure of, and you just want to. Oh, awesome! Thank you for that. There's a text now by Gabriel. I'll post that in the classroom as well. And yeah, so I really want people to come in and feel free to workshop ideas. If you want to sort of present your ideas, you can get that, schedule that ahead of time with us. But basically, so if we were to talk about the general themes and the general questions that we're sort of approaching, if so we're looking at the philosophical and literary concepts throughout the seminar of world and world creation. We talked a lot about this today, and we're examining the distinction between fictional and possible worlds, of course. Fictional worlds and possible futures, whatever you might want to say it. Specifically, if we can bring in the sort of text that we learned, or even the concept of just hyperstition and how it sort of plays into this role. And even we can discuss the concept of the weird. Both of these things are still available to the seminar. And a lot of things we're trying to see is how the creation of worlds can lend themselves to discuss the interconnections between temporal registers, politics, ethics, and these sorts of things. So the general question of the seminar is what are some of the ethical, political, and temporal issues at stake in the creation of fictional worlds? That's our general question, and that's why we'll explore many different versions in the seminar. Second kind of question that we're thinking of is, how is the concept of world necessary for politics as such? And a lot of this we're playing between the local politics, or we can think of it as a politics of the present, and a localist identitarian sort of politics, versus what we can think of as possible or politics of the future, or future politics. So how does the concept of world play into this? And when we think about this, we can think about like how self-reflexive do you have to be about consequences, the consequence of what you're doing, and thinking about them at sort of different scales, larger scales. So we have between local and the local politics and this sort of politics of the future, we have just sort of different viewpoints, where one sees local action as a necessary contribution to sort of future conditions, whereas the other is this sort of possible politics of the future that we sort of want to sort of group or think about are thinking about being a part of the active construction of a new world. So this is how maybe this concept plays out in these two different registers. But even thinking further, if we're to think of, like, for instance, Meillassoux' type 3 world, is the concept of world even necessary? If well, it is necessary even in it, because it's negating it, right? And in type 3, it abolishes the world. There is no world. World does not exist. So that's just some questions about the concept of world. And we brought up another question already with Chris, and that was how does hyperstition complicate the relation of fictional and possible? And we're thinking of this in terms of creating its own premise in regards, or creating its own premises in regards to politics. We can also think about it in ecological thought, which we talked about. So these are sorts of things we're looking at. So we're looking at literature based in maybe we can always look at how these would correspond to these categories of extra science fiction worlds, but we're going to try to pair it with different ideas. And mostly we're looking at like literature predicated about sci-fi, so it's predicated both on realist and speculative modes of storytelling. We're going to kind of go between, I think, especially when we get to Afrofuturism. And so I'm going to put, these are just the general questions, I'm going to put them in the sidebar, and so if anybody has sort of any need for clarification of these or anything, but they would be good for us to think about throughout these sessions. And and also if anybody has any further questions that they would like to present for this session, that would be also very helpful for us. I think all of us. Oh, the final question, obviously, that I'm missing, I'm sorry, is that we're thinking specifically about sci-fi as a genre, since we're going through a lot of sci-fi fiction, science fiction, is that, and thinking in political terms, is it political for just being futural, or does it have to be a politics of science, which I think we've discussed a little bit, and we've kind of maybe brushed over a lot of it in sort of quickly going through Meillassoux' short book. But I'd be interested in, if nobody has any, these are the general sets of questions on the right. I would be interested, though, if anybody has any other questions they would like to propose in this session, or if they're like coming to this seminar with certain questions that we can add to the list, so we can all collectively work towards these things. No? We're good with these sets of questions? Okay. Well,
So, sorry, I'll add one. I'm still really caught up with what Ben brought up regarding number as performativity, and like the numbering number, and what's it called? Treatise on nomadology. So math, I guess, I think is a cool thing.
okay.
That I guess you address, but yeah.
All right, good. Then, if there's no further questions here, then if I could briefly, because we spent so much time, Ben and I, and I've spent a lot of time talking for 2.5 hours. I'm sure it's getting annoying, and we'll get some other voices maybe involved. If you can just briefly tell me just a little bit about maybe your background, or why you're interested in these concepts, or maybe you're interested in only a specific book that we're reading that was on the syllabus. It would be nice to get a little bit of an introduction. So if I can call on people, if it's okay, if Derek, you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure. I guess I'm interested in in this seminar with the relation between hyperstition, particularly the kind of multiplication of coincidences, maybe with a paranoid method of fiction, say, the paranoid production of possible worlds. So that's I mean, I guess that's maybe a project I'm working on. I'm a PhD student at the Royal College of Art currently. I guess, independent researcher now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. Chris, do you want to? I mean, Chris,
Sure.
you're also interested in Hyperstition, but do you have a specific, any other
I don't
interest?
know. Yeah, I guess I'm not sure. I'm still determining that. I'm just studying philosophy, starting a grad program in New York City, but studied literature last time I tried grad school. So yeah, I don't know. Interested in the intersection. Happy to meet all of you.
Nice to meet you. I know you very well. Okay, Samir posted on the right. If anybody doesn't want to introduce themselves, that's okay. But if you want to sort of at least post to the classroom, it'll really benefit, I think, all of us. So we have a very diverse group. These classes are always kind of run in very diverse settings. So they sort of have a very interesting sort of trajectory to them. They go off on a lot of tangents, but I think they end up, as a whole, they end up being very productive. And I think a lot of people can get a lot of things out of these. But I really encourage everybody to sort of, contribute as much to the direction of the seminar as Ben and I would. You are more than welcome to derail us, take us on a totally different path during that session. I'm quite interested in working with everybody and sort of trying to break the wall of silence that's happening. And it's probably the most difficult thing about doing seminars in this setting is sort of the ability to communicate on multiple different paths. We can communicate via video, but we also have the sideline of chat. So I think within the next couple sessions, we kind of get used to each other, and it kind of gets builds and becomes very productive towards the end. So thank you all for joining us and being a part of this. And I guess we'll continue with any further discussion that we might have, or any further quotes that we might want to put on it. If the people who haven't read the book and don't have the book need some of it, I can try to help you get versions of it. But I recommend looking at the talk that's online if you can't get the book right now. It's quite useful. And then please contribute afterwards. And we'll see you next Monday. We'll discuss more. We'll discuss a very classic text of Possible Worlds, I think, and Mievo book, which I think is quite interesting. Has anybody read City in the City before?
3 times this year.
All right, cool.
I love it.
So,
I would urge anyone who would overlook The City in the City, I would urge you to please read it, because it's wonderful.
Good. So I hope you will be there with us next week.
Yeah, I plan on it for sure. But yeah.
Okay, so that text is also online. It's EPUB format. If you need different version, if you can't read ebooks or something, if you need a PDF, let me know. I can give you that. In general, thank you very much for being here. I think this will be really fun. And thanks.